started talking about some dehydrating. So again, my name is Andrea Smoots, and I'm in Washington County, and I'll be kind of doing the chatting with you. And then April Litchford, who's in Box Elder County, will be doing a few demonstrations for us. We'll just kind of jump back and forth, kind of keep you guys awake and excited about the things that you can learn about dehydrating. And I'm going to apologize at the beginning. I've been talking about freeze drying with some different people as well. So if I say freeze dryer for some reason, I really mean dehydrator, because that's the topic of our conversation tonight. So we're going to be talking about different things about how to choose a method for dehydrating, different things that you can dehydrate. And then we actually have Kathy Riggs. We have a guest video from her to talk about making homemade jerky as well, because you do that in a dehydrator. And that's an exciting thing for me, because I usually kind of shy away from working with meat. It kind of, seems like there's so many things I could do wrong, but when you watch her explain it, you'll realize just how simple it can be. So let's just talk first about the history of drying foods and what it's used for. You can see on the screen there that it's one of the oldest methods of preserving food. As far back as 12,000 BC, there's evidence that Middle Eastern and Oriental cultures dried foods, and they used the sun and the wind, which are natural dehydrators. We've come a long way since then, and we have a lot of options. Dehydrating food is a great alternative to canning and freezing. Maybe you don't have a lot of freezer space. Maybe you ran out of canning jars or couldn't find lids during COVID. It's super simple and safe, and it's not too hard to learn. The thing I love about it is you can do it year round, and you don't need to refrigerate anything. But the thing I love the most about it is that we often refer to dehydrated foods, especially fruits, as nature's candy. My kids gobble it up. I work with a lot of 4-H kids. Whenever I bring dehydrated fruit for a snack, they get so excited and they love to eat it. And so it's great for if you're going on car trips, if you're going to camp or go backpacking. I just finished backpacking in the Grand Canyon. My freeze dryer is broken, so I relied on dehydrated foods. And I tell you, I learned some things even I hadn't known already about. I dehydrated the ingredients for a pasta salad, and then I did what's called cold soaking it. And I think it was the best backpacking meal I've ever had. So just a reminder that there's some really cool things you can do with dehydrating. And then you can do things like jerky and nuts and seeds, which provide a lot of protein. And the thing that's also great is when you dehydrate vegetables. Say you have an abundance of vegetables from your garden and you don't want to can them all, so you decide to dehydrate some of them. They work great when you throw them into soups. They rehydrate wonderfully. So just a little bit of information there about dehydrating. This is a picture that our colleague Melanie took. This is pineapple she actually dehydrated. Looks a little bit different than the pineapple you might buy in the store. That has a lot of added sugar. The thing I love about dehydrating pineapple just fresh is it's super tasty, and you don't feel like you're eating that big glob of sugar when you buy the kind at the store. And I'm going to pause here and actually stop sharing my screen, because I want to get you guys excited about dehydrating. And one of the things April decided to demonstrate for you tonight is dehydrating pineapples. So let me stop sharing the screen, and I'm going to highlight her screen to make sure everybody can see her. And so let me spotlight her. Okay. So April, take it away.
All right. Hi, everyone. It's nice to be with you today. I'm excited to show you how to dehydrate pineapple. This is a wonderful treat. I actually practiced this a couple weeks ago just to make sure I knew what I was doing. And I dehydrated a whole bunch of pineapple. This bag fit about 1 pineapple. You can see there's not a whole lot left in the bag because I kept eating it. In fact, I told my husband, I'm like, I've got to quit eating this, or I won't have a prop to show at the lecture. But it's kind of cool. It gets nice and wilty, but it's still kind of pliable. You can see I can move it, and it doesn't break. So this is actually a really, gotta get to the right camera here. This is actually a really good pineapple. The drying technique was, we don't want it super, there's my camera. We don't want it super brittle when it's done. We like that little bit of a chew to it. And it really tastes kind of like fruit snacks, but it's good for you because there's not added sugar in it or dyes. One caution with pineapple is it tastes really good, so it's easy to eat a lot. But be careful because there's a enzyme in the pineapple, and we actually use it to like tenderize meat and different things like that. If you get too much of it in a concentrated amount, you can get some good cankers in your mouth. And another thing with eating too much dried fruit in general is it can cause some gut problems if you eat way too much of it. And it can be a little bit addicting. But I also find that another reason to dehydrate is I can get pineapples on a good price sometimes. So these ones were only $2.50 a piece, and they were really big ones. And we can't ever eat all of it. So I'm able to cut up some of it and enjoy that. And then I can dehydrate the rest and save it for later. And I never reconstitute it with water or anything. I just eat it because it's a really good snack instead of like the high sugar snacks that are out there. So one thing I wanted to show you, first I'll show you how to do the pineapple, then I'll show you the dehydrator. You want to make sure that your pieces of pineapple are as uniform as possible, so they're all about the same size. So I cut the pineapple off. I do mine a little different than Melanie did hers. Hers were rings. She had a core, a pineapple core, which is great. If you have that, you can do rings. But I usually do mine in small pieces because I don't have a core, and it's just easier to cut it off the core. So I will take the skin off, and you can see I get most of the skin off of the pineapple. And then I just cut it on the flat side where the core, before the core. And then I have a flat side to cut on, which makes it safer for my knives, to run across. And it's not rolling, but it also allows me to kind of even up the pineapple so I can make more uniform cut. So I usually will take off a little bit of the side. You can see by doing that, now I have a nice flat side that's all about the same height. And then I'll come in and do the same on this side. And of course, you won't throw this away. You're going to eat it because it's really good. And then there's no waste. Okay. You want your pineapple to be nice and ripe. So whatever you dehydrate, it's not going to change the fact that it's not ripe when you dehydrate it. You're just going to have not so good pineapple that you dehydrated. So make sure it's nice and juicy. You can see this pineapple has got a lot of juice in it. It's a dark yellow color. I'm going to show you the difference. I have another one I got, and it wasn't quite as good a pineapple. It's tender and it's slightly sweet, but it's not as deep yellow as this one. So these ones won't be as good, but we'll just mix them in with the others and hopefully it will still be a good treat. And then I'm just going to make cuts along the flesh of the pineapple. So you see I got 4 cuts. And then I'm going to turn it, and I'm just going to cut again, trying to keep it right about the same size. So about 1-inch cubes all the way across the pineapple. And I'm trying to keep my hand out of the way, but you can hold it together as you cut it. And I cut off the top and the bottom of the pineapple, so I already have a flat surface there. You can see a nice uniform pieces of pineapple. Okay. Now I'm going to move this out of the way, and I'm going to show you my dehydrator. So I have a Nesco dehydrator. It's a Garden Master. Andrew, you might want to spotlight my other screen, so then they might see the as well. You see the dehydrator in a little more detail.
Okay, I don't know if you're.
Okay, so this one is a Nesco. You can see dehydrator. And it's at the bottom, it has all of the temperatures that you can run food at. And then it has an on button on this left side. So it's a pretty simple dehydrator. You notice the fan is in the bottom. And it's nice, it's easy to clean. It's really not, it's a nice dehydrator. Really like this Nisco brand. And then each of the trays fit really snug and nicely on top of the fan. This one has, I think it has 8 trays, so I can get quite a bit of food on this dehydrator. I already have 2 of them done. One thing to note when you're dehydrating is that you want to leave some space for the food, for the air to circulate around the food. This will give you good even drying, so you don't want to really overcrowd the trays. And I have one here that's only half done, so I'm going to pull, only has half pineapple on it, so it'll be better to just pull off the extra, so everybody has room for that air to get up and heat all the pineapple of the fruit. This will just speed up the drying and will make it so that it will dry evenly. So I just kind of place it like that, and then when you move it, you got to just move it carefully or you'll undo everything you did. Okay, so this one, I'm just gonna push things around a little bit there and pull off some of them. But yeah, that's pretty much it for the pineapple. Now, my dehydrator came with these little mats. There, you can see they kind of look like a mesh. These are really great. Like I could have done my pineapple just on this, but you can see that there's those openings are quite large. So if you're trying to do something that's smaller than pineapple, it would fall through. The pineapple works fine, right? I don't really have to worry about the pineapple falling through. But one thing I did notice is I didn't put one of these silicone mats on one of my trays when I was doing it earlier, and they stuck pretty good. So with the silicone mat, it's going to make it easier to get the pineapple off of my dehydrator. And once food is dehydrated on this, it's hard to get it off. It's hard to clean it. You have to kind of soak it and scrub it, and it can be kind of a pain to clean. So these are helpful because they're easier to clean. They let the food release a little bit easier, and nothing's going to fall through there. So if you're going to do peas or corn or something small, these are a great tool to have. So if yours didn't come with it, hopefully you can find some to make it easier to dehydrate. Okay, so now I have three layers of pineapple all ready to go. And I will set my dehydrator for about 140, 145 degrees. I'll show you. I usually set it right between the 135 and the 145 and set it to work. And this usually, I think it took me, when I did 3 trays a couple weeks ago, and it took about 9 hours for the pineapple to be done. When it's done, how do you know it's done, right? That's kind of the question. One thing that I did is I can pick it up and it's not sticky. It doesn't stick to me. I can move it. It's pliable, but it's still, and it's quite a bit smaller. Notice it's like half the size of what I started with. Okay, so it's going to shrink. It's not going to be sticky. You don't want it crispy unless that's kind of what you're looking for. But I like it just like this. Okay, so that's how we do pineapple. I'm going to shoot it back to Andrea, and then we'll come back and I'll show you how to make fruit leather.
Okay, so again, like April said, she cut hers in chunks. Our colleague Melanie did hers in rings. You can do it however you want. The key is to keep it as uniform as possible so that you don't have some drying super fast and other things taking a really long time. So, which brings me to the slide. We're going to talk about the downside of dehydrating. To me, I personally don't see a lot of negatives to dehydrating. So let's cover it quickly because I want to turn around and focus on a lot of the positive things about it. But it will vary in time. Some things are very quick. If you're doing herbs, it's, an hour maybe. If you have big chunks of things, you're doing like the half of a peach or apricot, it's going to take a little bit longer. And we're going to talk about different methods of dehydrating. But if you're using the sun, it could take as many as 6 days. You do also have to pay a little attention to what you're dehydrating. And there was a question in the chat about having your fan on the bottom or the top. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. But no matter where the fan is in your dehydrator, usually you're going to want to rotate your trays and be testing it periodically because, again, some things will dry faster than others. And then when you're preparing the food, you don't get to skip the step. There's some steps that you don't get to skip. If you want great quality, good color preserved, things like that, there's a few steps you'll need to do that are similar to the canning or the freezing. And then there's some foods that just don't dehydrate well. Some of those things are avocados, olives, pomegranates, a lot of your citrus fruits. And then your vegetables that don't really dry that well are things like broccoli and lettuce. And I don't know if you guys can picture dehydrated lettuce, but it would pretty much turn into powder, probably, just kind of fall apart. We're going to talk about jerky a little bit later, and we don't recommend dehydrating or using poultry for jerky because the final texture and flavor is not as desirable as other things. And so just a few things to think about when you're thinking about dehydrating. We will be sharing some resources later, and I think there's a list of fruits and vegetables that really do dry well that can be found in the University of Georgia in a publication that I think we'll include in that resource folder. And if not, reach out to us. But okay, so let's talk about how drying actually preserves the food. So there's microorganisms like yeast, mold, bacteria that can be on our food, and they need water to grow. So if we can remove that moisture, then we can prevent that spoilage from happening from those microorganisms. We have a little bullet point there about concerns with jerky. You do want to be careful when you're working with meat. Some of our concerns are microorganisms they might contaminate the raw meat and they will multiply rapidly on moist, high protein foods, which is exactly what meat is. So you want to follow basic food safety procedures when you're handling meats. And we'll go over that again, but I think that it's never a bad thing to hear it more than once. But just keep in mind, make sure that you're washing your hands thoroughly for 20 seconds after you handle the raw meat. Use clean equipment and utensils. Keep that meat refrigerated at or below 40 degrees until you're ready to use it. If it's meat that's been in the freezer, make sure you thaw it in the refrigerator, not on your kitchen counter. And then if you're marinating the meat for the jerky, you're going to want to make sure you let it marinate in the refrigerator, not on the counter. And then also don't try to reuse that marinade. Go ahead and make up a new batch for your next batch of jerky. Part of that drying process is we slow down the enzyme action. We don't completely stop it. By slowing it down, the color, the texture, the quality, they don't degrade as rapidly once you've dried the food. So you'll notice when you buy bananas or you buy peaches or whatever, yeah, they're off the tree, but they do continue to ripen when you bring them home. And so we're trying to slow down the work of those enzymes when we do the dehydrating. So, okay, so let's go on and we talked about what you can't really dehydrate very well, but there's a lot that you can. So fruits, vegetables, you can make fruit leathers. April's going to show us a little demonstration about that in a little bit. We talked about jerkies. You can dehydrate herbs if you have a great herb garden growing. Pick those herbs. Don't let them go to waste, and you can dry those. Nuts and seeds. You can see a picture here. That's probably zucchini. And you can make some really great snack foods. Dehydrating is great. You can reconstitute it later if you're making soups or stews or different things. I've even made an apple pie out of dehydrated apple slices. But my family tends to eat it before I get to reconstitute it. They like it all just as straight snacks. Okay, so let's talk about choosing a method for dehydrating. When you're trying to choose a method, there's a few things you want to keep in mind. Air circulation, those people that dehydrated food, so many thousands of years ago, they used the wind and the sun because those are natural dehydrating factors. So you do want good air circulation. And then you want to have a good temperature. 140 degrees is ideal for most foods. If it's too slow, you might end up with some microorganisms that are trying to grow. If it's too fast, you end up with a condition that we call case hardening. And before I started working with extension, I did a lot of dehydrating growing up. My mom would do it because it was her way of sneaking fruits and vegetables into our diets because we love to snack on them. and she could pack them in the car. We did a lot of long road trips. I grew up in South Texas. It took a whole day just to get out of Texas to go see family. So those dehydrated fruits and vegetables were kind of like the coveted snacks. We loved them. But I didn't know what case hardening was. And I had that happen to me a few times. So it's when the outside of your food item dries, but you've trapped moisture inside, and then it can lead to mold growth. So you don't want to think, oh, well, if I turn the temperature up and make it really high, it'll dry faster. Because yeah, it'll dry faster, but it won't necessarily dry properly. But you'll get that outer part that dries and it's kind of hard. So anyway, keep that in mind. You don't want to rush a good thing. So make sure you're careful on those temperatures. So some of the methods you can use, you can do things outside. Down here in southern Utah, we have great sunshine and hot weather. And before I got a dehydrator, I dried a lot of things outside. So you can use the sun. You can use solar dehydrators. You can dry things right on the vine out in your garden. And then you can also dry things inside. And we're going to talk about just room drying, using an oven, and then actually using a dehydrator. Let's jump right into some of these. So if you use the sun, the sun is best for foods that are high in sugar and acid, which is your fruits more, and then a few of your vegetables, whole peppers, beans, peas. You can see a little drawing on the screen of like a homemade, it's like a screen right there. So you can use screens and other things. You want to make sure that the weather is hot. So like I said, in southern Utah, we have plenty of hot weather. So come on and visit me and we'll dry some food for you. But up north, it gets hot too. You do want to check the humidity. Where I grew up in the South, we couldn't really dehydrate things just outside, even though it was very hot where I grew up. We also had like 90-95% humidity. So that was not a good combination. So you want to make sure that you have less than 60% humidity and then having a breeze. You don't want to put it somewhere where there's no breeze and that air just sits there, because it's that wind that helps keep things moving along and helps add to the drying factor. The work that's involved for sun drying, you'll need to build some racks or screens. You're going to want to turn it a few times a day. Covering it can be advantageous to keep the bugs off of it. And sometimes you might even have to bring it in at night, depending on what the weather's doing where you live. You can cover with cheesecloth. You can put another screen over it. And then you'll need to pasteurize it. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. It's not very expensive to do it that way. And you can do a lot at one time if you have some big screens. I used to put screens across sawhorses so you can get a lot done. So there's a few things about using the sun. If you have a solar dry, like a solar dehydrator, there's kind of an image there in the corner. Again, it's good for the foods high in sugar and acid, like your fruits, kind of the same as using the sun. Similar to temperatures, but the temperatures will increase a little bit in the solar dryer. It does get a little hotter there. You'll need to make a dryer that needs to have a vent so that you can keep that air moving. And again, you'll need to turn it. So very similar to using the sun, and it can take several days. Then drying on the vine is probably the least amount of work involved. You just leave it right out there on the vine. If you're doing beans, it's great for the beans. I used to think it'd be awesome if you could make raisins on the vine, but you can dry grapes. We get a lot of grapes down here, and they turn into homemade raisins really wonderfully, but you can't really leave them on the vine because the birds will beat you to them. And so, but it's great for the beans. Leave them in the pods, let them rattle, and that's all you got to do for that, except the pasteurization. But we're gonna get to that. So just to recap, when you're drying outdoors, make sure you're using the foods that are best for drying outdoors, those high sugar, like the fruits. You don't want to do meat for sure outside. And then most of your vegetables, you're not going to dry outdoors. Make sure it's hot and dry and breezy, covering it up to keep the bugs off of it. But here's the pasteurization that I mentioned. So anytime you dry food if you're drying it outdoors where there's a chance for insects to be introduced to it or bugs to land on it or whatever, you're going to want to pasteurize it before storing it. So one method you could do is the freezer method. So you want to seal the food in the containers, put it in the freezer and leave it there for at least 48 hours. Or you can pasteurize it in the oven by placing it on a tray and then put it in an oven that's preheated to 160 degrees and leave it there for 30 minutes. So, and again, the reason we do this is to ensure that we have a safe and high quality food product at the end. because we want to make sure we kill any insects and or their eggs that may have been introduced when we might not have realized that our cover flopped up and something got under it or something like that. So make sure you do pasteurize the food if you use one of the outdoor methods. If we dry food, when we dry foods indoors, we have a lot of options there as well. We can use a food dehydrator like April showed us. Most of those will just sit on your countertop. I have seen some pretty large ones that don't fit on a countertop. You can use a convection oven. You can actually just dry things on the countertop like your herbs. You can use a conventional oven, and then you can use the microwave, but just for herbs. They dry pretty fast. And somebody actually just asked a question about the screens, and I think in my excitement to talk to you about it, I forgot to mention that when you use screens, you do want to make sure that you use like stainless steel, Teflon coated fiberglass, or plastic screens. Don't choose screens that are like copper or aluminum, because the metal might oxidize or discolor or even corrode. And Melanie gave a good answer in there as well. Just make sure that you make a good choice for your screens there. Okay, so back to the indoors. So let's talk about some of these options. We have room drying, and you can see on the screen some of the different things you want to pay attention to. It's great for the herbs, nuts, chili peppers, and partially dried fruits. You still need to make sure you have low humidity. You want to make sure you have air movement. Those are two key items for any way you decide to dry. You can string your peppers or your herbs in bundles and hang them up. You can put them in paper bags with little openings for air circulation. A lot of options there. And so that's if you're going to just dry in the room. And then let's see, oven drying. That's another option. Most people do have an oven. Oh, one thing I did think of, if you're going to just dry things in the room, you might want to take into consideration seasonal factors like, is your air conditioner running? How cold or hot the room might be, things like that. And that can affect the drying time as well, just like the outside temperatures. So when we dry in the oven, you do want to make sure that you have an oven that will register a temperature as low as 140 degrees. Otherwise, the temperature will be too hot and you'll end up with that case hardening that happens if it's too high of a temperature. When you use the oven, you're going to leave the door open just a little bit. So you'll want to consider that, the fact that you've got your oven on, the door is open, and factor that into kind of the environment in your house as well. But you can use cookie sheets with liners, or you can put cooking spray. And then you want to make sure you set your oven racks a couple inches apart. Don't have them, right close together. Because like April mentioned, you need that air to circulate so that it can reach all the food in order to dry at a decent rate. And you'll want to rotate your foods, especially in the oven. Make sure that you don't end up scorching any of them. It can take a bit longer in an oven than in a dehydrator. So that is a downside to that. If you don't have a dehydrator, just remember that an oven is an option. We talked about a dehydrator. April showed you hers, and you can dehydrate a lot of food. Don't try milk products or eggs. Save those for freeze drying or just eat them. And so anyway, but the equipment for a dehydrator is, you'll want the dehydrator, the actual machine, and then you'll need trays. And of course, you'll have to plug that in somewhere. You can buy a variety of them. In fact, let me see. I think we're going to get to a slide that will show a couple different kinds as well. And you'll need to rotate those trays. So that's a little bit of work involved there. But just like any other method, you need to move the food around so that if you have like a bottom layer, and a tray sitting on top of it, you want to kind of trade those positions so that they dry evenly. One disadvantage of a dehydrator is the limited capacity. And if you try to, a lot of dehydrators, you can add extra trays. And I've tried that. I've tried putting a lot of trays, but you do reach a point where that's not so good. So don't get so excited like I did and just take, I've got trays from this dehydrator and trays from these, and they're interchangeable, so I'm going to stack them all together. You have to be careful, because at one point you end up with way too many trays in there like I did, and it was not effective. But I just called it a science experiment. So some of the features you may want to look for in a dehydrator are, where you're going to store it. Will it fit on your counter? Looks like I actually have duplicate things on here. Sorry about that. Both sides are the same. So you can read with your left eye and your right eye at the same time and read both columns. But actually, you want to make sure it has a thermostat that you can control, because if you do jerky, you're going to want it as high as 100 and higher degrees, and some things you want lower degrees. So just keep that in mind. But I wanted to show you this slide because you can see in those pictures, April had a round dehydrator. There's a picture of a round one. Some are square. They come in all different shapes. And sometimes the fan or the heating element is on the top or the bottom. But you do want to make sure that there's a fan, that there's a heat element. I've seen people make dehydrators before. So make sure that if you whatever dehydrator you use incorporates those different elements, something to create the heat, a fan to keep the air moving, and then some kind of vent to keep that air moving in and out so that you don't just trap all that moisture in there. And then going back to whether the fan's on the top or the bottom, I don't think that I have a slide that actually tells specifically about that. I have several dehydrators. I kind of like to dehydrate food. I have one with a fan on the top, one with a fan on the bottom. I find that for some foods, I like my fan on the top because I don't worry about things dripping down or me dropping things into the little hole in the middle because I'm a little clumsy at times. But then there's other things that I prefer the fan on the bottom because if I'm setting my dehydrator somewhere, I like to have, this might sound funny, but I like to have the weight of the dehydrator on the bottom in case if I have it on the counter and somebody goes and not that they're going to bump it off, but if I'm going to have several trays on there, I really like that weight on the bottom instead of sitting on the top. But that's just my preference. They both work very well. I've dried the same foods in both of them. I have colleagues that have the rectangular ones and they've dehydrated some wonderful foods. So it's really a personal preference when it comes to what kind of dehydrator that you use. So they can just like anything in the world, the costs can vary depending on the features that you decide that you want. Some have extra trays. Some come with those silicone mats that April showed you. Sometimes you can just buy those separately. And so just look at a few different ones and decide what's important to you. But they can range from under $100 to over $200. So just keep that in mind. But my experience is they all dry the food. They just have those different bells and whistles. It's kind of up to what you like. Maybe you're partial to a certain color and that design only comes in one color. Just be happy while you're dehydrating. That's the most important thing because it's a fun process. So this talks about the different types. You have your square ones are often the ones that have the horizontal airflow where your heating element and your fan are on like in the back or on the side. And so one advantage of that is the air is not traveling up and down through the food. It's traveling across. And so the flavor mixing doesn't happen as often. So you can dehydrate different kinds of foods and you won't have as great a chance of those flavors mixing. Also, the juices won't drip into your heating element, which I haven't had a lot of trouble with that because my dehydrator that has the fan and the heating element on the bottom has a hole in the middle and all my trays have a hole in the middle. So the manufacturers kind of do a great job of lining those things up. But, I could go to put my food on there and drag it across the top of that hole, I guess. And then the vertical airflow ones, those are more of your round ones. And there is a disadvantage to that in that if you dehydrate a variety of foods at the same time, because that air is being forced up or down, you may notice a little bit of mixed flavors. And so those are probably the things I noticed the most on that. And so we talked about temperatures for drying. Optimum is 90 to 140 degrees. If you get too high, you get what we call that case hardening. Just another reminder about that. And you think it's wonderful, it's crisp on the outside, but when you break it in half, you'll notice there's a lot of moisture trapped inside. And that is not a good thing. Again, you want to make sure you have low humidity in whatever environment you're dehydrating, and then you have air movement because that air movement will help dry the food faster as well. When we're actually doing the drying, a few things to remember is April showed you that she had peeled her pineapple already. So you do want to wash your produce. You're going to trim it, peel it. And one really important thing to remember, and we say this when we talk about canning and other processes, is whatever you put in, quality in is the same quality coming out. So you don't want to dehydrate the food that's starting to rot on your counter and think it's going to turn into this beautiful dehydrated product because it will be just overripe and weird. You do want to make sure you're choosing quality food to dehydrate. You want to keep those pieces uniform. The best thing, especially if you're picking your fruit off your tree or out of your garden, you want to dry it as soon as possible after picking to kind of capture that top quality. And then one thing that we just threw in here to let you know is, like we mentioned earlier, when you're dehydrating food, fruits and vegetables, well, mainly vegetables, you want to treat them the same as if you're going to freeze them. And that involves blanching them. You'll blanch them the same as if you're freezing. And if you're not familiar with blanching, I believe I have it on my next slide, in fact, but so you want to use a large quantity of water. You're going to, bring it to a boil. You're going to drop that food in there. And then when you pull it out, you'll put it in ice cold water so that you can stop the cooking. Because you're not the purpose of blanching is not to cook the food. You're just prepping it. Let me go back right here. And when you do blanch, in that little blue box, it says if it takes more than 1 minute to return to boil after adding your veggies, then you're getting too many veggies in that water to blanch. And so you want to make sure you don't overload it so that you can bring it back to a boil and boil it for that recommended amount of time for the blanching. And you can also steam blanch as well. So that's just a little bonus that we threw in there so that if you decide to dehydrate vegetables, it won't be in your brain, oh, I've got to blanch those veggies in order to get the best quality. April mentioned about determining how to decide if fruit was all the way dry. But when it comes to veggies, you'll want the vegetables to be crisp or brittle. They're not going to be pliable like the fruit. Like when you saw April moving her pineapple and stuff around, when you dry vegetables, they're actually going to be more crisp. And some vegetables will actually even shatter if you hit them with a hammer. But we're going to talk about conditioning, and I probably should have done that first. But when you dehydrate fruit, you'll do what's called conditioning, and I'm going to explain that in a minute, but vegetables won't require that the same way. And basically what the conditioning does is kind of distributes the very last bit of moisture in your dehydrated product, kind of distributes it among everything in the package. It like equalizes it, I guess is the word to use. So I'm going to jump to here. You guys have been listening to me for a while. While I'm switching over, I'm going to go ahead and give you guys a commercial break by having April show us a little about doing fruit leather before we talk more about it, because she did a great job of like giving you guys the tidbits and some of the facts. And I feel like that's a great way to learn, is to actually watch her doing it.
Yeah, fruit leather is fun. There's lots of different kinds that you can make. We had a in-person canning class today, and we made a pumpkin applesauce fruit leather. So I'm excited to eat some of that tomorrow. But it's pretty simple. You can use canned fruits or canned fruits to make your purees. We just use the canned applesauce and a canned pumpkin and added some spice, and then we can make fruit leather with it. Or you can use, the extra fruits that you have from your garden. Strawberries are coming on really good right now, so you can maybe make an applesauce strawberry one. Sometimes berries need to be mixed with other things because they don't create as full of a fruit leather, I've found. It tend to get really thin, but you can do it still. So if you have some good recipes for that, give it a try. And in a dehydrator, it's really easy because you just put the leather on there, you let it dry, pull it off, and package it. So I wanted to show you how to get prepared for the fruit leather. One thing you need is a good cooking spray, and you need some kind of silicone pad, something that's going to allow you to put something that's pretty close to liquid on it. If we just try to put it on this, we're not going to have any luck, right? It's just going to go right through the opening. So we need something like the silicone pad. I've tried to make a makeshift one by using plastic wrap and wax paper. It doesn't work quite as well, so I recommend getting these mats. And I also tried using a rectangular dehydrator last year. It had tons of peaches, so I wanted to make a lot of fruit leather, and it was one of the dehydrators that pushes the air forward, so it was in the back of the dehydrator. And just know it was really it wasn't my dehydrator. I was borrowing it, and it was a lot different than my round one, and I ended up with brittle shards. Wasn't chewy, good, yummy fruit leather. I would just use it like in oatmeal or things like that, but it wasn't as ideal. So if you have a different dehydrators, you're going to have to do some experimenting and see how it works with fruit leather. I didn't have any problems when I was just trying to freeze dry like pieces of peaches, but when I was doing fruit leather, it was different, very different. So just be aware of that. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to lightly coat this silicone mat with cooking spray, and then I'm just going to rub it around and make sure we got all the little spots. We don't want to really, really spray it like you would a cookie sheet when you're getting it ready, but you want just enough oil on this to help release the dehydrated fruit. It can be quite sticky, so just be aware of that. All right, then I'm going to move this out of the way for just a minute. And what I'm doing today, because I don't have any fresh produce yet, my strawberries are getting close, but we're not quite there, is I have some peaches that I need to use up. They're nearing the end of their shelf life. My kids keep moving out, so I don't have as many people here to eat them. So I just drained 4 quarts of peaches. My peaches have already been peeled, so I would recommend blanching and peeling peaches if you're going to do that. Peeling apples using an apple sauce. You don't want to leave the peels on there because it can just cause a funny texture and maybe not dry as uniformly, but it's mostly a texture thing. If it's a small, a more tender skin like an apricot, you can leave those on there. I do that sometimes with apricot fruit leather. But pears and peaches I peel and apples I peel. So I just had my peaches draining in this colander because I want to get as much liquid off of them. So these peaches have been sitting in a syrup, a light syrup, for a year and a half. And so they need to be drained off. They're just really full of liquid. We don't want our fruit leather that liquidy because then it takes longer to dehydrate, right? So I just dumped them in this colander and then just let them drain in this bowl for an hour or so. And I kept it in a bowl just in case the fruit leather gets too thick. Then I can still use the peach syrup to put it back into my fruit leather. So it's just a way to keep the flavor and the sweetening. I also don't need to add anything to this fruit leather, right? Because I already had it packed in a light syrup. So I just need to blend it and it's ready to go. If you're doing other recipes, it will change. You know, they'll have some things that you'll need to add to it to make it what you want. You can just do straight fruit though. Fruit is pretty sweet in and of itself, so it doesn't really need a whole lot of flavoring. Another fun thing about fruit leather is you can experiment with spices and other flavorings, maybe some mix-ins. We could do a peach applesauce, strawberry applesauce, those kind of things. You can do a mango one. We did that today, and we added a little, I can't remember what the spice was in the mango one, but I know we added pumpkin pie spice to the pumpkin applesauce fruit leather. So there's just a world of possibilities out there for fruit leather and lots of fun recipes. Okay, so I'm just going to get my blend on there. I'm just going to blend it really quick. It really is super fast. The more uniform, the better it's going to dry. Remember, we're getting that surface area all over in the dehydrators, getting the same amount of air, same amount of heat. And so we want to create that with the food too. If we have really thick and really thin, it's not going to dry the same. Okay, so you can see it's thick, but it's not super thick. This might still be a little liquidy. I probably should have pushed some more of the water out of it, but it'll still dry. Last time I did it, it took about 10 hours. This time I think it'll be a little less because I took more water out. Okay, then I'm going to get my screen over here that I've prepared, or my tray, and I'm just going to pour the puree down the middle of the circle. If you get it too close to the edges on either side, it will expand. So the fruit leather expands as it starts to dehydrate a little bit. And so it can drip over the sides if you get it too thick and too close to the edge. And also another funny thing I had happen is a lot of times it gets thinner as it gets to this edge because it starts to go up the side, right? So I had it too close to the edge, and I had some that went up over the side and then got hard, and it actually cut my finger because I didn't notice it, and I kind of ran my finger around the edge and it cut me. So it can be super sharp, and that the edge can get really brittle. So try to keep it more in the middle. So I'm going to show you that. So I'm just going to pour it on there. Okay. It helps if you can pour it in a pretty even layer. And then I'm going to use a spatula. Over here. My camera's backwards from where, sorry, my hands are clean. So I'm just going to get it away from the edge and then carefully spread it out, making it as uniform as possible. Remember, if you have really thick spots, they're not going to dry as quickly as the thin spots. And so you can end up with some areas that are brittle versus areas that are pliable. Also, be careful not to spill or get it too thick so it spills. These can be a nightmare to clean if you get the food, like I just spilled on this one as I'm talking. So you can also do this off the tray and try to move it, but I find it's a little easier here, and just be careful how you're spreading it. But once the food is dried on it, it's really hard to get it off. Okay. All right, so that's pretty good. I think we've gotten it away from most of the edges. I think we're pretty even. I'm just gonna tap it just a little, kind of even that out, and that's it. I'm done. I'll stick it on my face of my dehydrator, and I'm going to turn it on the same temperature as my pineapple, and it's 10 to 12 hours, so it'll be a little longer than the pineapple. Just depends on the humidity and heat movement around it. Okay, and then once your fruit leather is done, and I was so meaning to do some last night so I could show you this, but kind of ran out of time. I'm just going to show you some that I have already done. When the fruit leather is done, you'll be able to touch it and it won't stick to your finger. It will still be slightly pliable, but you'll be able to pull it off the sheet, off the silicone mat in one pretty big sheet. Sometimes I can get the whole thing off in one pull. Just pull gently. I just kind of score one edge and then pull it. It shouldn't really need loosening, especially because we sprayed it with Pam. It should come off. And then I just spread out some plastic wrap. So you can see this piece right here. I just have plastic wrap. I put down like sections of you can cut them into sections because it's round. It's a little unwieldy. So I just cut it into big pie shaped sections. And then I put it on top of the plastic wrap and roll it up. So I'm just going to show you how we're going to go backwards as I unroll it. So I roll it up and then I just use scissors and cut it into smaller bits like this. And then when you unroll it, the plastic wrap helps you unroll it. And you can see it's nice and pliable. It doesn't break when I touch it. It doesn't flake off. And it comes off in a nice sheet like that. And then the plastic also releases really easily from it. So, you did a good job when you can get the plastic off, and easy to eat. Okay, there you go. That's fruit leather. This one was a little thin, like I can see through it. And so I'll make it a little thicker next time just because I prefer it that way. But depending on how thin and how thick it is, will depend on how long it takes to dry. Then I usually keep mine in a plastic bag like this. I don't use oxygen absorbers, and because I have the same problem Andrea does, everybody eats it before it gets close to shelf life. But you could use a vacuum sealer and just put these pieces in there. You put an oxygen absorber in there and put it in a mason jar with a lid. There's other things that you can do to prolong the shelf life of it. But if mine lasts 6 months, I'm like, yeah. Anyway, that's it for me. It's been really nice to be with you. I'm going to keep working and get my fruit leather all done so I can start drying it.
So that was fantastic. April was making me kind of hungry. I love homemade fruit leather. My kids love it. My grandmother used to make it out of apricots. She lived in Utah. We lived in Texas, and we didn't get apricots where we lived in Texas. And oh, apricot fruit leather, I just think I've died and gone to heaven because it reminds me of my grandma and all those fun times. But anyway, I guess I don't need to be nostalgic with you guys, but it does make for some great memories with your kids or your neighbors or your friends and family. Um, but there are some pros and cons to doing fruit leather. April mentioned some of the different things. It makes for a quick snack. And then the thing I love is, so many of the things that we buy in the store have ingredients I can't even pronounce. I'm not a fanatic, but if I have a chance to make something that I know exactly what's gone into it, especially for my young kids, then that always kind of made me feel just a little bit better because I knew exactly what they were getting. I could control all those additives. And the kids loved it. Like, you saw how April rolled up her fruit leather? It's kind of the same as when you buy it from the store and they unroll that big long paper or whatever. And my kids thought it was just awesome. Their friends at school were like, "Well, how come your paper's clear and mine's white?" Whatever it was. But it was fascinating for them. Some of the cons are that you do lose some of your um, vitamins and the antioxidants, but you do keep the iron and the fiber through the dehydration. And then the fruit leather is not as filling as giving the kids or the family, whatever, fresh fruit. And you do want to remember that it still contains all those sugars and calories. I think that's one thing that our brains kind of forget when we're eating like the freeze dried fruits and vegetables and the dehydrated things is we really do need to be careful because we can eat more of it, but we're still getting those same amounts of sugar and such. And then it is a little bit chewy. So that's one thing that some people don't necessarily love about it. And so, okay, so we talked about drying the fruit. I'm not going to go through this whole thing again. It will be in the resources you get. You'll prepare it, wash it, peel it, things like that. And one thing I did want to say is I learned years ago from somebody that bottom bullet point, if you're drying fruit whole, or even if you're doing halves, you're going to want to crack the skin, or what they call check it to speed up the drying. And so, but the thing I learned too is like when I do apricots, because we get a lot of those down here where I live, I actually just dry them in halves. So once I split them in half and take the pit out, and I wish I had one to show you, but I actually flip it inside out, if that makes sense, like poke my thumb through the skin side and make it pop inside out. So the fleshy part is like splayed out. And it seems to, it dries faster because I'm exposing more of that flesh to the air because it's broken up. Now it's not just that solid curved half. It's now poked out. It looks like little mountains growing out of it, kind of, if I could say that. And it actually keeps a better color and seems to dry faster. So that's one little trick that I've learned. Another thing with the fruit, and I do have a slide coming up on that. So let me pre-treating the fruit. That's one thing I wanted to get to. We talked about blanching the vegetables, and I saw in the chat that somebody asked about buying store-bought vegetables, and those have been blanched if they're freezer vegetables. But when you pre-treat your fruit, there's a lot of options. Now, there's people who they'll do what's called sulfuring or use a sulfite dip. Those are very effective, but it's time consuming and it's problematic for people that have sulfur allergies or even bronchial problems. It can be difficult to find the sulfur, which for me personally, there's something like, I think, do I want sulfur on my food? That just like seemed weird in my brain, but it is very effective. But there's other things you can use. You can use ascorbic acid. You can use mixtures. You can use fruit juice to dip the one fruit into a different fruit juice. You can use honey, and then you can also blanch your fruit as well. One time, I think I used a honey mixture. So a little bit of honey and some water, and I did some bananas. And my kids are like, "Mom, bananas are not supposed to taste like honey." I kind of overdid it. You'll learn as you go. Practice a little bit. The people you feed it to will respond and be like, "Why does it taste like this?" And you'll realize, oh, put a little too much in there. But pre-treating the fruit will help it keep a better color. And so when you dry it, just another quick reminder, April mentioned kind of spread things out, kind of put them evenly along the trays. Just remember, if you do dry multiple things at the same time, some things will dry faster than others. So you're going to want to keep an eye on your drying food so that the things that are dry you can pull out so that you don't over dry them. You can actually dry things to where they're super brittle and So when you dry the fruit, like April mentioned, you're going to want to make sure keep it pliable. One thing I learned is sometimes if you break a piece in half, it will feel dry on the outside. But when you break it, you can actually see little beads of moisture on the inside if it's not quite done. And so I'll look for like my thicker piece or my piece that feels a little bit squishy to the touch, bust that open, and then it confirms that yes, there is still some moisture in there. And so you just want to leave it in to continue to dry. And so you don't want to have any moisture in there. It'll have about 20% moisture content, but you don't want to see beads of moisture. It shouldn't stick to itself. Like if you took that piece of pineapple that April showed you and you fold it in half, it shouldn't stay folded in half stuck to itself. It shouldn't be that tacky. So just a few little tricks for determining whether or not the fruit is dry. Here's some pictures that our colleague Melanie actually used in a presentation she did. I really liked them, so I wanted you guys to see them. One, to reinforce the fact that you can you can dehydrate things like tomatoes. And my kids will eat the dehydrated tomatoes like candy, just like they do fruit, especially these little baby cherry or grape tomatoes. And if you guys have plants of those, I don't know if yours are like mine, but they tend to grow beyond what you need, while the bigger tomatoes kind of get a little bit finicky on me. And so we can't always eat them as fast. And so dehydrating them is an option. And so you can kind of see on these trays on the one side is when they're getting ready to be dehydrated, and then you can see what they look like when they're done. And here's a better view. So kind of fun. They really are quite delicious. Another up close view there. And they'll shrivel up a little bit. Okay, so after you dry the fruit, let's talk about storing it. I mentioned something about conditioning the fruit. But first, when you pull it out of your dehydrator or bring it in from outside, whatever method that you use, you want to let it cool down. If it's warm still, let it cool 30 to 60 minutes before you package it, because if you package it too soon, you could end up with moisture buildup in the container. And then that will actually ruin your food. But you also don't want to leave it sitting out for days, because if the air gets a little humid, then you'll end up with moisture being reintroduced into the food. So it's kind of got to keep an eye on it and find that happy medium. So here's a picture. Like these are just put into a Ziploc bag. You can do that. Like April mentioned, we eat these kinds of things really fast at our house. So they don't sit around very long, but you can put them in mason jars, plastic containers, in Ziploc bags. You could put them in Mylar bags as well. But let's talk about the conditioning of the fruit. What it does, I mentioned before, is it equalizes the moisture, because you'll have parts of the fruit that are super dry. And then, like we mentioned, there's 20% moisture still in there. And so when you put it all together in a container and you kind of close it up, let it sit for 7 to 10 days and go around and kind of shake it a little bit so you don't have anything sticking together if there was a more moist piece than the other, and kind of watch for any moisture condensation in the container. And if you notice it starting to do that, you'll want to go ahead and to dry it a little bit more. One time I had a few pieces I didn't pull out. They had kind of dried more than I wanted them to. But then I had some pieces that were a little bit not as dry as they should be. But mostly they were just about there, but maybe just a titch too early. And as I put them in those containers together, that moisture kind of equalized throughout, and the parts that were not as pliable kind of balanced out with the parts that were a little pliable, and it did exactly what it was supposed to in that conditioning. And so my whole batch. So fruit leathers, just another quick summary. You saw April make that fruit leather. She showed you how to smear it on the tray, things like that. But one thing I did want to highlight, your fruit can be from bottles like she had it. That was her home canned peaches. Or if you say you had a great, you had an abundance of fruit, you're about to leave on vacation, there's no way you're going to be able to dehydrate it fast enough. You can't can it, whatever. But maybe you have some freezer space. You could actually puree it and then freeze it. And then you could, when you're back and have some time, you can thaw it and go ahead and dehydrate it that way. So there's it's really flexible when you're dehydrating. But you'll note on there, the color is usually better if you're going to store it long term. If you're making jellies and you have fruit pulp that's left over, you can actually take that fruit pulp and add that to applesauce to flavor your fruit leather. So lots of options when it comes to fruit leathers. And April mentioned some combinations, and normally you wouldn't think about putting pumpkin with, I think she said applesauce, but it's pretty amazing. That was one of my ways of sneaking in some different fruits and vegetables for the kids. You can combine a lot of things with applesauce, and it sort of helps kind of mellow the flavor or blend the flavors, and it kind of makes for a good flavor. So just a few things to keep in mind if you have an abundance of fruit and you're not sure what to do with it. And so just a reminder, make sure that you get that fruit leather smeared on that tray about 1/8 of an inch thick. Get it even. And then when you go to pull it out, you're going to want to test it by making sure that the outer parts will dry a little, or wherever it's thinner will dry faster. So kind of look for that thickest part and see if it's still soft enough that you can make an indention in there. And if so, you're going to want to dry it a little bit longer. And so you can keep it for up to a month at room temperature, but you can also freeze it for up to a year. So that's an option if you want to save a little bit and have your kids or you or your family not eat all of it at once. You can throw some into the freezer for a snack later. Now let's jump to meats. I have a video that I'm just going to put right on here, and then I'll go back through and just summarize some of what Kathy shares with us let me get to the video here. And so let me just play this, and then we can cover a few of the details again, because Kathy does a great job of explaining how to make jerky. And that was something I wasn't just familiar with. So let's see what Kathy has to share with us.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Kathy Riggs, Utah State University Extension Professor in Family and Consumer Sciences. I'm in Iron County, Utah, which is in Cedar City. I'm happy to share with you today a recipe for making ground beef jerky. Normally, we think of jerky as being strips of meat. And I grew up with strings of venison jerky across my parents' basement food storage room. And that's my introduction to jerky. I was so fascinated when I learned that you didn't have to go out and actually have some kind of a beast from the wild to make your jerky. Beef jerky is wonderful, and this is a very easy recipe. You'll find that it's fun, and you'll want to do it over and over again. For ground beef jerky, there are basically 6 ingredients. Not hard to find. Let me just show those to you. You use garlic powder, coarse black pepper, onion powder, a type of salt that doesn't have an anti-caking agent in it, like iodized salt does. I really like the kosher salt. You can use any of the other mineral-based salts that you find in specialty stores also. And soy sauce. You can find soy sauce that does not contain gluten if that's an issue in your family. And then an optional item is liquid smoke. My 2 favorite flavors are the applewood and hickory. We'll be using applewood today. The 1 pound of extra lean ground beef. You'll want to make sure the ground beef that you use is very fresh, nice and pink. And I'll just crumble that in. I do like to use gloves when I'm doing this marinating. It's kind of the same like making meatloaf, unless you want some of the marinade under your fingernails. So we'll mix this all together. The main thing here in mixing the marinade in the ground beef is that you'll want to watch for any of the pink ground beef that isn't covered with the marinade. It will settle some throughout as this is in the refrigerator, and we'll set it in for a minimum of 2 hours. You're welcome to have it go in longer if you so choose, but 2 hours is the minimum. After at least 2 hours, take the marinated ground beef out of the refrigerator and load it into a jerky gun or a jerky shooter. Press the strips onto the dehydrating tray. So I put the first tray on the base of the dehydrator. You could do this on your counter, whatever is most convenient for you. But because I'm working on a low table today, I can put it on and I'll just squeeze out even strips. And you can even up the ends if you so choose. And again, you'll have overall about 30 total strips when all is said and done. Place in the dehydrator at 145 degrees Fahrenheit until strips are pliable. Usually around 6 to 7 hours will accomplish this. This temperature allows the marinated ground beef to cook evenly at a rate that will cook both the interior and the exterior of the strip. So after the jerky has had a chance to dehydrate fully in the dehydrator, it's a period of around 6 to 7 hours. I like to err on the side of too much time, and so I have had this jerky in here for 7 hours. You'll notice that it does still have a little bit of residual oil on here. Not oil, but fat from the ground beef. But we're going to take it right off from the trays here and put it onto a baking sheet to finish the process. Even though we've had time for the meat to dry in the marinade, there is still a chance that you could have some bacteria that was introduced while you were handling the meat. So we want to make sure we get rid of any evidence of E. coli, and we can do that by heating the jerky further in a preheated oven at 275 degrees for 10 minutes. The temperature we're aiming for is 160 degrees Fahrenheit for the meat. However, it's going to be a little bit challenging to put in a monitor inside these little strips of jerky and get that temperature exactly. So what we're going to do is after that 10 minutes, we're going to want to have a very have the sound of a sizzle, if you will, of the meat so that we are sure that it is hot and ready for storage. Notice that I kind of fudged a little bit with a little bit of extra. This will be my free sample at the end. You can do the same at your house. All right, I'm ready to put this in the oven now. All right. First thing that you'll probably notice is how much each piece has shrunk. And I can hear the sizzling, you probably cannot, but I guarantee it is sizzling. These will stay good at room temperature for approximately 2 weeks, unless you put them in a vacuum sealed container or put them in with an oxygen absorbing packet.
Whoops, I was muted. Sorry about that. I really enjoy watching Kathy, so I almost played it for a second time. She does a great job explaining how to make the beef jerky. I just wanted to jump back. Let me go back to right here. So what is jerky? Most of you may know, but it's a lightweight dried meat product. It's great for backpacking, camping, if you're just out for a day outing. It doesn't have to be refrigerated. You can use beef, pork, venison, smoked turkey breast. But one thing I wanted to point out, and that's why I wanted to go to this slide, is if you use wild game, you need to treat it to kill the trichinella parasite by freezing it. You can freeze portion 6 inches or less thick at least 0 degrees Fahrenheit for at least 30 days. But then remember, that doesn't kill the bacteria. But it will kill the parasite. And then down on the bottom of this screen, you can see, again, I just want to reiterate that raw poultry is not recommended for jerky because the final texture and flavor is not very desirable. So just wanted to touch on that again. And then let's get back to where we were. Okay. So when we're making the jerky, it's important to remember that, again, when you're working with the meat, those microorganisms that are in the raw meat, they can cause diseases and illnesses. And bacteria loves to multiply on the moist, high protein foods. So it's really important that you follow the directions. When you dehydrate that meat, you're removing that moisture that will support the growth of the microorganisms. And then by heating it and doing that final step that Kathy did by putting it in the oven, that pasteurization, then we're ensuring that it will be, you do want to make sure that you follow those guidelines and you'll have a safe product in the end. So you can heat the meat strips in the marinade before you dry them. These are some ways to get that meat to the 160 degrees. And if you heat the meat strips first, the drying time will be reduced, but the color and the texture will be a little different. Or you can do what Kathy did and heat those dried strips in the oven after you've done the actual dehydrating. And so make sure that you follow the temperature and the time for that. So let's talk about what makes the safest jerky. I mentioned these steps earlier. It's good basic information. Make sure you wash those hands, keep your utensils clean, keep that meat in the fridge until you're ready to use it. Use ground meat within 2 days, and then red meats within 3 to 5 days, or you can freeze it for later use. Don't thaw it on your counter. Make sure you thaw it in your refrigerator. If you're going to marinate it, make sure you do that in the refrigerator. And then just remember, don't reuse the marinade. We talked about the 160 degrees. One way to do that is putting it in the oven afterward. But you can also have that case hardening effect with the meat, just like you can with the fruits or vegetables. And that's where the outside dries faster. So make sure you don't try to speed up the process by turning your temperature up. You want to really follow those guidelines to do it at the right temperature so that you don't end up with undesirable conditions. We kind of talked about this using wild game. Make sure that you treat it to kill the trichinella. And then I think we're just going to jump to, if you're concerned about the E. coli, sometimes that's a question that comes up. And again, by heating the meat to that 160 degrees in those two different methods, either heating the meat strips before you dry them or heat the dried jerky after you dry it for 10 minutes in that 275 degree oven. Super important steps right there to keep it safe. And then you can store it. Kathy showed, she talked about how you could store it. So like other foods, keep it in a sealed container. And if you want to keep it a little bit longer, if everybody hasn't eaten it all up, then you can put it in the fridge or the freezer to kind of make that shelf life a little bit longer.